And the thing is, what's difficult in this is that, because in the Tibetan systematization of the 4 tenet schools, which some of those tenet schools existed as somewhat differentiated in India itself. I don't believe that they were as clearly differentiated, each with their own catechism as they appear in the Tibetan, commentaries that were written centuries later. But, there were, the terms Vaibhasika and Satantrika and so on. But they weren't the terms. There was the middle way, but there wasn't Svatantrika Madhyamaka and Prasangika Madhyamaka in India. Those terms didn't get, those 2 branches didn't get differentiated until Tsongkhapa, I believe. I mean, much, much later. Okay, but anyway, what was my original point here? Yeah, that a lot of these terms that we use in refuting things, they aren't truly existent, they aren't inherently existent, and so on. Those terms don't seem to have been ones that the Buddha used. I mean, in the Pali Sutras, I don't find those expressions. Yeah, I mean, sometimes you find certain words, but they're not used like that. And it seems like what happened is, in the early centuries after the Buddha's parinirvana, that the Abhidharmas, they started writing commentaries about trying to systematize things, because the Buddha gave all these different lists, so they're comparing and contrasting the lists. And then they also really made this incredible dissection of the mind and mind moments and all of that kind of stuff that later became like what we study now as mind and mental factors. Yeah, so that all started with all the Abhidharma. But some of these words, like the svabhava, which we translate as inherently existent, that became prominent like in the Abhidharma. But when it started in the Abhidharma, it meant one thing. It just meant everything has like its own nature, I mean, the nature of fire is it's hot, and the nature of earth is that it's solid, So it started out to mean nature like that. And then as time went on, these debates arose, and people started saying, well, does that mean things exist by their own nature? Now that's a whole different ballgame than if they have their own nature. Okay? Because exists by their own nature was meaning, do they inherently exist? So then you get this whole new term with a new meaning that nobody really talked about before. Yeah? And so then how do you look at the original sutras? Well, you could look at them and say, well, the whole meaning is in there already. Or you could say the meaning wasn't in there at all. And so with the Nalana system, what it does is it has 3, the 3 turnings of the Dharma wheel. So it looks at the first turning, the Pali Sutras, and says, well, a lot of this Madhyamaka meaning just isn't there at all, except there's a few sutras where we can find it. So if people studied it and they understood it, it could come out. But then, on other occasions, you often hear, well, the Buddha didn't need to do so much explaining because the people there didn't have so many defilements like we have. And, because you saw the Buddha was like teaching these people were becoming arhats right, left, and center, except for a few of them you read about, But there's a lot of them that kind of got it right away. Well, they had, very, very refined faculties, very sharp faculties, a lot of good karma, a lot of familiarity from past life. So apparently the Buddha didn't need to say so much because they understood it just by the few words that he did say. Okay? So you get this weird thing of, well, it isn't in there, but, they could understand it. So, I'm not sure about all of that, actually. But it's really interesting. If you see, especially, kind of this thing as something that happened over the centuries, and new terminology, new concepts becoming put into public discourse. I mean, sure, individuals could have understood them in their meditation before because of incredible wisdom and imprints they had from previous lives, but becoming popular in common discourse, that happened over centuries. Yeah. And but then you get into the whole discussion there of, well, was it in the original sutras, and then did people interpret things in a certain way, or was it in the sutras and they just drew out the meaning? Yeah. And so then you get a group of people who says, well, no, you can't interpret anything because that's, who are we? We're ignorant beings. We can't interpret what the Buddha says. So what the commentators did was the meaning was already in there. They just drew it out so we could understand. They didn't interpret. Yeah. Because, how can the Buddha's an enlightened one and we aren't, and, so how can you interpret anything? But then if you study it from the historical viewpoint, as we do, because, we grew up with the disciplines of historical analysis, then, you might say, well, no, you can see that there was interpretation going on because those terms didn't exist then, and then they appeared here, and they took on different meanings here, and then more debate grew here, and, and to see them like that. Yeah, so it kind of depends who you're talking to, because some people, if you even hint that anybody interpreted the Buddha, oh boy, impossible. How dare you say something like that? Only ignorant people interpret the Buddha. Yeah? Yeah?
So if the terms true existence and such weren't there in those initial moments of the Buddha's oral teaching, what was there? What was describing that?
Oh, no. Well, they had the words eternalism and nihilism. And so, for example, in the passage I was just telling you about, is that there the Buddha is refuting, absolutism and nihilism. Yeah, he didn't say, see, in Prasangika, absolutism equals inherent existence and nihilism equals total non-existence. But those terms, inherent existence, that wasn't there. So they refuted things in terms of absolutism and nihilism at that time. Yeah. But then you could say the different schools gave different meanings to absolutism and nihilism. Yeah? And so sometimes you can look at this and you can see, because also in the Pali Canon, they're chiefly focused on refuting the self, meaning the person. Yeah? And they don't have the term the selflessness of phenomena. That term didn't come until later. Okay? But they aren't saying that phenomena inherently exist either. Yeah. It's like that wasn't something they discussed back then. Now you could say, but the people may have had the grasping at inherent, not the acquired grasping, but the innate grasping. So they may have been grasping at inherent existence even though they didn't talk about it. That certainly is true. Yeah. But, people who were sharp, maybe they could see the negation of that just already in the words that were there.
Weren't they using the term anatman?
Yeah, right, anatman. Yeah, that meant, self. And there, it tends to mean, in the Pali Canon, no solid person, no real person. Okay? Whereas in the Mahayana tenet systems, self can also mean true existence, existing by its own characteristics, inherent existence, depending upon what school you're from and what you're negating. Then self has a different meaning. Okay? So, which is often confusing when people come to the Dharma, because Buddha said no self, but then here he's talking about a self, and so it's contradicting himself, and yeah. So I mean, this is clearly why we need commentaries too. Okay, so now